The latest intel coming out of Ukraine suggests that Russia has lost anywhere from one-third to one-half of its tanks in the conflict so far. However, the real reason why Russia's tanks are being destroyed at an unprecedented rate might not be what you think. Advanced Western weapons are definitely playing a major role, but it's Russia's incompetence, ineffective military leadership, and thievery that's actually leading to the most losses of Russian tanks in Ukraine. Before we dive into the exact reasons why Russian tank numbers have been cut nearly in half, we need to examine some key statistics first. We said that Russia has lost approximately 50% of its operational fleet. But what does that mean exactly? Russia started the invasion with around 3,000 tanks. Recently, several independent organizations have provided data that around 1,000 tanks have been destroyed, while another 544 have been captured by Ukrainian forces. Although there is no way to know exactly how many tanks have been destroyed without visual confirmation of each one, some organizations such as the International Institute of Strategic Studies believe that Russian losses could be closer to 40%. An intelligence organization in the Netherlands reports it has visual evidence that no fewer than 1,900 Russian tanks have been either destroyed or captured since the beginning of the invasion. This is a staggering two-thirds of the initial invasion force. Regardless of the exact number, it's clear Russia is losing a lot of tanks. Then there's Russia's total equipment losses. It's estimated that somewhere between 9,100 and 10,000 pieces of vital equipment, such as naval vessels, aircraft, artillery, armored vehicles, and of course tanks, have been destroyed. What this also means is that tanks account for around 10 to 30% of Russia's total equipment loss. Approximately 1 out of every 4 pieces of hardware eliminated by Ukrainian forces is a Russian tank. So it's clear that Moscow's having a difficult time keeping its tanks protected, and the reason why has several different explanations. It should also be noted that Ukraine has lost around 3,000 pieces of equipment during the war, which is actually pretty astonishing when at the beginning of the conflict, it looked like Russia would claim a quick victory as its forces plowed toward Kyiv. Instead, the Ukrainian army has proven to be exceptionally resilient, resourceful, and able to counter whatever Russia throws at them. It's a testament to the fighting ability of the brave Ukrainian men and women who are at the front lines every day to take back their country. It's because of them that Ukraine's equipment losses are only around 30% of Russia's. The tanks Russia's losing help Ukraine in more ways than one, which we'll come back to in a little while. Western nations have also pledged to send Ukraine more tanks in the near future, with at least 18 Leopard 2s already arriving from Germany and more on the way. The United States has said it'll send 31 M1 Abrams to Ukraine this year, which would provide the nation with the most sophisticated and deadly tank on the planet. The UK is reported to be shipping 14 Challenger 2 tanks of their own, and Poland has also said they'll be sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine as well. Even with the influx of tanks being sent to Ukraine, they're still vastly outnumbered. It's estimated that before the war, Russia had somewhere around 12,420 tanks and 36,000 armored vehicles at its disposal. As we said earlier, Russia launched its invasion with around 3,000 of its more modern tanks, consisting of T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. This is only a fraction of its tank reserves, but it has been whittled down after Ukraine has dealt defeat after defeat to the Russians. Russia is currently pulling out old Cold War-era tanks, such as the T-55 and T-62, and trying to replenish their tank numbers. It's estimated that Russia has roughly 2,800 T-55s and 2,500 T-62s in storage. Footage has been circulating of these tank relics being loaded aboard trains and shipped toward the front lines. In fact, British intelligence has released a report stating that T-55s have already been spotted on the battlefield. The bad news for Russia is that these tanks, many of which are over 50 years old, will fare even worse against Ukrainian anti-tank weapons and tactics due to their outdated technology. So what's actually happening to Russian tanks in Ukraine, and why have so many been destroyed or captured? At the beginning of the war, Russia was losing around 10 tanks every single day to Ukrainian forces. Current estimates put that number closer to 150 tanks a month. And since Russia can only produce around 20 new tanks in the same amount of time, it's facing a modern tank crisis. There's no way Russia can hope to hold back the incoming Ukrainian offensive using the tanks they have left. This is one of the main reasons so many armored relics like the T-55 are being brought to the front lines. The crazy part is that these Cold War tanks can actually be found in museums that discuss the history of warfare. Perhaps the most shocking and impressive part about the numbers coming out of Ukraine and the war is that Ukraine isn't just destroying Russian tanks, they're also stealing them. At the beginning of the conflict, Ukraine was estimated to have around 858 tanks, and even though they have lost some in battle, the number of tanks Ukraine has at its disposal now is around 953. Only a small fraction of this increase comes from tanks being sent from Western nations like Germany and Poland. The rest are former Russian tanks that have either been captured or repaired after being damaged. Sources calculate Ukraine has taken and repurposed somewhere around 500 Russian tanks. This is not only impressive in its own right, but it also means that for approximately every 3 tanks Russia loses, Ukraine gains 1. Russian tank numbers are diminishing rapidly, while Ukraine's are continuing to grow due to the incompetence and low morale of Russian soldiers and their leadership. We're going to touch on this more in a bit, but it is amazing how Russia is actually helping Ukrainian forces more than many other countries by allowing so many of their tanks to be captured. Putin will never admit it, but he has given Ukraine more tanks than any Western nation has, which is a fact that is so insane it's tough not to laugh at. Besides stealing Russian tanks and embarrassing Putin's forces, what other factors have led to Ukraine being able to lower Russian tank numbers by around half? There are several answers to this question, and we're going to examine each one in detail. A main contributor to Russian tank losses is the modern Western anti-tank weapons that were being sent to Ukraine during the war. The United States has supplied Ukraine with over 4,000 Javelin anti-tank missiles since the beginning of the conflict. The United Kingdom has sent another 3,600 next-generation light anti-tank weapon missiles, or NLAWs, as well. Both of these weapons can be used by infantry units to decimate Russian tanks, and that is exactly what's being done. The reason these anti-tank weapons are so destructive is that they exploit some major vulnerabilities in the Russian tank armor. The most common and most destroyed tank in the war thus far is the T-72, which has been in operation since 1968. These tanks weigh over 41 tons, and at its strongest point, its armor is 280 millimeters thick. However, the Javelin and the NLAW take advantage of the weaker armor on the top of the tank by detonating above the vehicle instead of hitting it straight on. On most older tanks, the armor on the top is significantly weaker than the front hull or turret. This is because when the tanks were designed, there were no anti-tank weapons that could accurately target the top of the vehicle. Instead, the T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s were developed to combat other tanks, which meant that they'd most often be hit with oncoming shells. However, warfare has advanced tremendously over the past few decades, and now infantry units can take out a tank from a safe distance with a single Javelin missile. This is a hard lesson that Russian tank crews have been forced to learn since the beginning of the war. More modern Russian tanks have reactive armor, which absorbs the impact of explosions and disperses it to reduce the amount of damage done. However, the Javelins get around this defense by including 2 warheads in each missile. The first detonates to damage the reactive armor, and the second explodes at the same time, penetrating the tank hull and killing anyone who's unfortunate enough to be in the vehicle at the time. The combination of striking the tank from above and the double warhead makes pretty much every Russian tank on the battlefield vulnerable to Javelins and NLAWs. However, it's not just the effectiveness of Western anti-tank missiles that's causing Russia to lose tanks at an astonishing rate. There are also flaws in the tank designs and armor themselves that have led to a large number of vehicles either being incapacitated or completely destroyed. Russian tanks were designed to be mass-produced cheaply and as quickly as possible. To put this into perspective, during the Cold War, around 100,000 T-54s, T-55s, 23,000 T-62s, 25,000 T-72s, and 5,500 T-80s were built. After the Cold War ended, another 5,500 T-90s were built, and supposedly T-14 Armadas are still being developed, although none have made it to the battlefield yet. What this mass production of tanks means is that corners were cut and many safety measures to protect the crew were scrapped. There is no better example of this than one of the biggest design flaws in any tank ever created. Early on in the war, the Ukrainian military found that hitting the Russian tank turret in just the right spot would cause its ammunition stores to explode, jettisoning the turret into the air and killing anyone inside. The reason this happens is because when the older tanks were designed, the ammunition stores were placed under the turret near the crew instead of at the back of the tank like in most modern tanks. This was done to cut costs and save space, but resulted in a very dangerous situation for the soldiers within the tank. However, the potential loss of life was less of a concern for the Soviet Union than pumping out large numbers of tanks efficiently. On top of this fatal flaw, older Russian tanks were not maintained properly, which led to the degradation of their armor and other components. Some of the tanks that are making their way to the battlefield today could be 68 years old. In fact, many of the tanks in storage had to be stripped of their parts just to keep the tank operational. The blatant disregard for crew safety and the maintenance of Russian tanks has allowed Ukrainian soldiers to destroy such a large percentage with relative ease. Now Russia is trying to update, repair, and modify even older tanks to replenish their numbers, even though they're in worse condition than what's already on the battlefield. This problem is exacerbated by the sanctions placed on Russia. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund estimated that Russia's GDP dropped by 2.1% in 2022 because of these sanctions and the toll the war is taking on the Russian economy. Many of the key components that Russia needs to update its tanks come from the West. For example, Russia's main source of optical sensors for their tanks was France, ball bearings for their vehicles were shipped from countries in Europe, and semiconductors were delivered from the United States. Now all these nations are preventing companies operating within their borders from doing business with Russia. This has greatly reduced Moscow's ability to modernize its older tanks and get them to the front lines. Russia now needs to buy lower quality supplies from countries that are still willing to do business with it while recycling components like microchips from other sectors. Drones are also playing a role in the devastating loss to Russian tank numbers. Like with the Javelins and NLAWs, drones attack from above. Their maneuverability and versatility make any tanks that are dug in or traveling slowly in a convoy an easy target. The Ukrainian Security Service posted videos online of drones destroying Russian tanks and armored vehicles, and Foreign Policy Research Institute stated Ukrainian drones have destroyed at least 4 T-72s and T-90 tanks, 9 BMPs, a BTR, MTLB, and a Ural truck. Ukrainian forces have also been using drones to scout areas and uncover the locations of Russian tanks, which have then been taken out by anti-tank missiles. The United States has sent more than 100 Switchblade anti-tank drones to Ukraine. These drones can be fitted with a warhead that is dropped directly above the tank. The drone's ability to hover in place or quickly fly over their target means that sometimes the crew inside the tank have no idea they're in danger until it's too late. The drone can hit a tank with precision, which means the vulnerabilities that were discussed before are often taken advantage of, resulting in the tank becoming a smoldering heap of charred steel. Russian tanks have also fallen victim to some old-school technology as well. At the beginning of the war, some Russian convoys reached 35 miles or 56 kilometers long. These miles-long convoys made them easy targets for explosives that can be deployed along roadways by Ukrainian forces. For some unknown reason, Russian tank crews have even been recorded driving through known minefields, thinking they pose no danger to their vehicles when nothing could be further from the truth. The tanks activate the mines explode, and the tanks are rendered inoperable. What is even worse for the Russians is that sometimes the mines leave the tank intact with only slight damage, but the crew still abandons them. These vehicles are then repaired by the Ukrainian engineers and added to their ranks, which is one of the reasons the Ukrainian tank numbers have been able to grow while Russian tank numbers are plummeting. But perhaps the biggest reason Ukraine has been able to capture so many Russian tanks has to do with Russian incompetence. According to Oryx, an open-source intelligence website, around half of the tanks Russia has lost have either been captured or abandoned. Most military strategists believe this is due to the incompetence of tank crews and unclear orders from Russian leadership. There are numerous examples of still operational tanks being abandoned for truly unbelievable reasons. For example, the crews of dozens of tanks fled their vehicles because they ran out of fuel. Imagine the logistical incompetency that had to take place in order for this to happen. Firstly, the crew should have known how far they could go before needing to return to base. On top of that, no one thought to equip the tanks with extra fuel drums just in case of emergencies. And lastly, the Russian commander should have given clear orders on where to go and when a refueling supply should be expected. The incompetence across the board has led to more Russian tanks being abandoned than any other factor. Tanks have also been abandoned because they've gotten stuck in the mud or driven into a ditch. Again, with well-trained tank crews, this wouldn't be an issue. They would have known the limitations of their vehicles, or at the very least, knew how to call for support to salvage a disabled tank. Instead, Russian soldiers are abandoning one of the most important weapons they have and pretty much handing them over to Ukraine. There probably aren't many things better for an army than finding a fully functional enemy tank that just needs a little fuel or needs to be pulled out of a ditch before being operational. But the level of incompetence isn't entirely surprising. One of the other reasons that Russian tanks are faring so poorly is due to the fact that many are being controlled by undertrained crews. In fact, some Russian tanks are being driven and fired by conscripts who have a little more than basic training on the vehicles or warfare in general. Approximately 300,000 Russian men were conscripted to fight in the first year of the war. A recent decree signed by Putin allows for an additional 147,000 conscripts to be recruited by July of 2023. It's hard to blame the Russian soldiers for panicking in seemingly non-lethal situations, such as getting stuck in the mud, when they have never been in a combat situation before. Ukrainian troops, on the other hand, have had access to NATO training for years, as the goal was to allow their military to meet NATO standards for future admittance into the alliance. This means that poorly trained Russian conscripts are going up against soldiers who have been practicing some of the most advanced battlefield techniques on the planet. It's no wonder Ukrainians are either destroying or capturing Russian tanks at such an astonishing rate. But there are some abandoned Russian tanks that have been difficult for even the most advanced Ukrainian soldiers to salvage. Some vehicles have been driven off of bridges or found beaten up beyond repair while trying to maneuver out of difficult terrain. These situations arise due to Russian incompetence more than Ukrainian warfare, but the result is still the same. The Russians lose a tank and the Ukrainians gain one, or at the very least have a vehicle to salvage parts from. British intelligence released a report stating that at least 30 armored vehicles, including operational tanks, were abandoned after a battle on the outskirts of Volodar in January 2023. The Ukrainian military reported that 130 armored vehicles were also destroyed during the battle. This failed assault not only cost the lives of Russian soldiers, but was also a devastating shock to morale. Abandoning 30 pieces of vital equipment after a single battle is just not how an efficient or trained army operates, but it just goes to show how incompetent many in the Russian armed forces are. All of the abandoned vehicles and mistakes made by the Russians bring us to our next point. The reason that Russia has lost nearly half of the tanks initially deployed to Ukraine has a lot to do with outdated strategies and bad decisions by the Russian military leadership. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, many military commanders were working off bad intel. It was suggested that Russian forces would be able to roll into Kyiv and the Ukrainian people would either lay down their weapons or welcome them with open arms. This was clearly not the case. We don't have time to get into all the bad decisions made early on in the war, but suffice it to say, the leadership of Russia, including Putin himself, was given bad intel on the willingness of the Ukrainian people to be reincorporated back to Russia. This meant that when the initial push toward Kyiv commenced and Russian forces met heavy opposition, they were not ready for it. This led to heavy tank losses at the beginning of the war, up to the point that Russian forces began retreating from Kyiv and continually were being pushed back toward Russian borders. It was during this time that many Russian tanks were also abandoned as convoys were attacked and the unprepared tank crews panicked and abandoned their vehicles. At this point, farmers used their tractors to move deserted Russian tanks to locations where they could be repaired and repurposed for the Ukrainian military. Many of the losses at the beginning of the war and the current losses sustained by the Russian army have to do with the inadequate tactics. Tanks continuously went into battle without enough fire support. This left them vulnerable to infantry units wielding anti-tank weapons such as the Javelin. And the most absurd part is Russia has continued to use these failed tactics over and over again. Rather than modifying their strategy, it seems that the plan of Russian leadership is to continuously throw tanks and men at Ukrainian forces in the hopes that eventually something will change. This has many military analysts baffled, as it is clear to everyone but military leaders in Russia that if they don't change their tactics, the number of men and tanks they'll lose could cost them the war. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, which is exactly what Putin and his military advisors are doing. However, the biggest tactical error that Russia has made, and one of the largest contributing factors to them losing so many tanks, is the Russian military leaders refuse to use a combined arms approach to warfare. Combined arms are the core of most modern offensive operations carried out today. Very basically, combined arms tactics are when infantry, artillery, aircraft, and tanks are deployed together in order to provide effective support for all units. The incredible thing is that the T-72 was designed for these types of operations, but Russia isn't using the tactic for some reason. Instead, Russian tank battalions are rolling into areas that are still heavily defended by Ukrainian forces without much support. This leaves the tanks open to attack by anti-tank missiles, drones, and close-range ambushes. If Russia was using combined arms tactics, these tanks would be supported by Russian infantry and air support to help deal with any Ukrainian soldiers that were focusing fire on the tanks. For whatever reason, Russian military leaders refuse to send the appropriate air support to scout locations or to aid tanks and armored vehicles when they enter combat. It's almost as if Russia is afraid to use its aircraft. Maybe the cost of losing planes and helicopters is not something they're willing to tolerate, but the loss of over 1,000 tanks is acceptable. Then there's also the fact that Russian troops have sustained an estimated 200,000 casualties so far in the war. This means that more and more conscripts are being sent to the front lines. In combined arms tactics, these infantry units play a vital role in protecting tanks, especially in urban settings. Ukrainian soldiers use guerrilla tactics in these types of battles, where they'll hit Russian armor hard with mines, explosives, and anti-tank missiles, and then retreat to safety. Having Russian infantry on the ground to protect the tanks against this type of resistance is a key tenet in combined arms tactics. Instead, the current Russian tactic seems to be that tanks are left to fend for themselves in situations where their maneuverability, sight, and weapons are severely compromised. It is these terrible decisions made in these situations that have led to so many tanks being lost to Ukrainian forces. But credit must also be given where credit is due. Ukrainian soldiers and their leaders are doing everything right. They're using combined arms tactics effectively, which has allowed them to decimate Russian tank and infantry numbers. The training that Ukrainian military leaders received from NATO has given them a better understanding of wartime strategies and allowed them to repel the initial invasion and push Russian forces back. Even with a significantly smaller military and fewer resources, Ukraine has made Russia pay dearly by incorporating combined arms operations into their counteroffensives and adjusting their tactics as needed. If Russia wants a crash course in how a war should be fought, all they need to do is look at how the Ukrainian military is operating. This might save them from losing the other 50% of their tanks in the future to outdated tactics, incompetence, and low morale. Now watch Russia just lost the biggest tank battle of the war, or check out why Putin has a huge weapons problem.